Democratic presidential candidate Amy Klobuchar took part in Wednesday's Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on Capitol Hill. The Minnesota senator was away from the campaign trail and took her turn to question the Justice Department's Inspector General.
Let's remember that this is not about one election or one party. It is about our democracy. What can we do? Well, we can be honest, and we can stop making political hay out of this, and we can actually take some actions that would protect our election in 2020.
For the latest on 2020, let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns and Ed O'Keefe. Caitlin is our CBSN political reporter, and Ed is a CBS News political correspondent. Welcome to both of you. Caitlin, I'm going to start with you. So we saw Senator Klobuchar there on the Hill doing her duties as a senator. Is this sort of the beginning of the end for the senators on the campaign trail? Are we going to see them in Washington a lot more often now?
Well, we are. And as senators like Amy Klobuchar are really busy kind of racking up endorsements, trying to organize their campaigns so that they can kind of operate independently as the senator and others will be called back a lot in January to do the impeachment hearings. But for someone like Klobuchar, who actually has been gaining some ground in Iowa, or doing okay there. This actually could provide her an opportunity to give her, a bigger platform. We've been talking a lot about kind of the perils that the impeachment inquiry might pose for someone like Klobuchar, keeping her away from the campaign trail. But this also gives her an opportunity to have a big national platform. These hearings are broadcast all over, all day. This could be a way for her to kind of break through in a way that's more difficult when you're not talking about impeachment.
Yeah, I feel like she really broke through on a national stage during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings.
Exactly.
So that's a very good point. Ed, Mayor Pete Buttigieg released the names of clients from his time as a management consultant at the international consulting firm McKinsey and Company. The clients included Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan and the Postal Service. So, Ed, is it clear whether this will impact his campaign in any way?
Not yet, Tanya, because we know that his rivals are actually continuing to pour over his work history now and some of the reports that he may have been involved in. It's an interesting list of clients and sort of shows you the scope of the work that folks at McKinsey do. Everything from a grocery store chain in the Toronto, Canada area to the Department of Defense overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Postal Service at a time when it was trying to figure out how to stop bleeding money as mail volume was plummeting. And, you can check these reports. His name doesn't appear as a lead author on any of them. He would have been an analyst sitting there with his laptop, basically poring over spreadsheets and, other data as these teams help put together the kind of reports that they do. But what we should expect is that his rivals in the coming days, and perhaps by next Thursday's debate in Los Angeles, will come up with some evidence that suggests that he was, part of those attempts to downsize various companies or industries at the expense of workers, and maybe at a time when prices were rising for consumers. Certainly the work he did for Best Buy, for example, or for Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, likely to come under more scrutiny. We checked on, for example, the Postal Service report because it was something about how the Postal Service was losing money, and they were proposing ending Saturday mail and forcing the clustering of mailboxes and closing rural post offices, which at the time was dismissed by Congress as a no-go because enough people called in to say, don't you dare touch my post office. And the Buttigieg campaign told us that he wasn't working on the proposed cuts portion of that report, but the proposed revenue, things like selling greeting cards or opening up insurance services at your post office in a way to increase revenue for the Postal Service. So it's going to take a few days probably till we know fully what exactly the potential damage of this is, but at least at first blush doesn't appear to be anything terribly significant.
All right. A new poll out of Iowa shows Biden, Sanders, and Buttigieg in an extremely close race. Joe Biden maintained his support with 23% of the vote, while Sanders has 22% and Buttigieg 18%. So, Caitlin, you were just in Iowa, boots on the ground, talking to voters. What do you make of those numbers?
Well, it's interesting to see Biden maintaining a lead here because we've been talking a lot about in how other polling he's been kind of falling behind in a place like Iowa, and there has been conversations about whether he does in fact need to win Iowa to win the nomination. I think as we talk about this transparency battle, as we've been calling it, between Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg over the past week, week, this does serve Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden pretty well, because those are kind of their top rivals for leading here. So you're kind of seeing Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders focus on their own campaigns, kind of remain above the fray, while Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg are kind of duking it out. You do see some overlap in a voter base, especially in Iowa. And so I think the Biden campaign might look at this poll and kind of be happy that they're not really involved in these fights right now.
It's interesting that Warren sees Buttigieg as more of a rival, though, than Sanders.
It's interesting, and in our CBS News polling in Iowa, there does show overlap of support among Buttigieg supporters. About a plurality of voters, actually, of Buttigieg supporters picked Warren as their second choice. And we're in the heat of the moment right here, and this is where you're seeing these campaigns really try to edge each other out as we get closer to Iowa.
I just heard you say vice versa. It'd be sort of interesting if we could have a little offshoot debate with just Warren and Buttigieg, right? We should start a whole new series of offshoot debates.
Well, yeah, and it's just, it's telling that in Iowa and then some recent surveys in New Hampshire, it appears that his rise is coming at her expense. And so that's why you've seen this focus over the last 10 days, especially by Warren on Pete, because she's seeing her declines come as he gains, especially notably in another survey in New Hampshire this week.
I find that interesting because I don't see them as occupying exactly the same political lane.
They don't, but what they do is they attract the same sort of higher educated, higher income white liberal voter that you find plenty of in Iowa and New Hampshire.
That's right. All right. So there's a Politico report claiming former Vice President Joe Biden is signaling to aides and perhaps to others as well, very obliquely, that he might only serve a single term and would not run for re-election if elected president. But of course, he's also denied that. So, Ed, Biden is 77 years old. Those are the facts, and as well as some of the other candidates, he's continued to be questioned about his age. So how much of a factor is age in this race?
So we found in our CBS polling, at least, that it's not necessarily considered a factor by a majority of voters. At least that's what they tell us. Whether or not they, in their private thoughts, feel otherwise, that remains to be seen. But clearly it is a factor and will continue to be. And the last time we asked the question, actually, I believe it was right before Bernie Sanders announced he'd had a heart attack. So it will continue to be an issue. If he were to win the presidency next year and run for re-election, he'd be 82. Nobody's run for president, especially run for re-election at that age. And so there is some chatter among supporters and critics of Biden about whether he'd be up for that again. But today in Nevada was stopped by reporters and said, no, that's not the case. I'm ready to do this. I will do it for 2 terms if need be. And I think, that's why, especially, and this is totally speculative, of course, but if we're going into next year with Biden emerging as the nominee, his vice presidential pick is probably going to be that much more critical, not only from a political standpoint, but from a practical standpoint, because we will have never elected a president that old. And sorry if that ticks off anyone watching, but the reality is we've never had somebody that old. So it could very well become a factor, and it's something he'll have to consider, again, should he emerge as the nominee.
As, by the way, the American population ages better than it ever has in history.
Exactly.
So that perhaps is part of all of this. But, Caitlin, there is some softening on the harder end of the Democratic Party toward Biden, that end of the party that was sort of, no way, Biden is too old, too establishment. We need someone younger or better, newer ideas. There seems to be some softening around that.
Well, the argument that the Biden campaign has been making really aggressively, at least when I was in Iowa, is that you may have seen all these new candidates come up, Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren, but Biden is ready to take the job on day one. That's what the campaign has been arguing. And when you talk to Biden's supporters, that's something that they reference over and over again, that they kind of trust him to do the job and that they want him to kind of go in and fix it quickly. So this idea of, whether he would serve a second term, his supporters, at least in Iowa and the older ones, aren't necessarily thinking about that right now. You also ask, you look at his events, especially in Iowa, and they are made up mostly of older voters. There can be some criticisms of that, but we know that older voters tend to be reliable caucus goers.
And Biden does seem to have a lock hold on the older Democratic voter and the African-American voter, at least right now. All right. Caitlin Huey-Burns and Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much.